December 1993, Los Angeles. The Sunset Strip was buzzing with an unusual tension that winter evening. Grunge had exploded from Seattle and taken over the music world, but now the backlash was beginning. Critics were calling it a fad. Radio stations were quietly shifting back to more polished sounds. The music industry, always quick to declare movements dead, was already looking for the next big thing. At the Whisky A Go-Go, two bands were scheduled to play what should have been a routine showcase for industry executives and music journalists. But everyone in attendance that night knew this was more than just another concert. This was a statement about the future of alternative rock. Stone Temple Pilots had arrived first, their tour bus pulling up outside the venue at exactly 6 p.m. The band was riding high on the success of Core, their debut album that had gone triple platinum and proved that bands outside of Seattle could master the grunge formula. Lead singer Scott Weiland stepped off the bus wearing leather pants and a vintage rock shirt, his dark hair perfectly tousled, every inch the polished rock star. "Where are the Seattle boys?" Weiland asked the venue manager, lighting a cigarette as he surveyed the scene. "I heard they were supposed to show us how it's really done." The comment wasn't entirely innocent. For months, there had been subtle tensions between the original Seattle grunge bands and the newer acts that had adopted their sound. Some critics had dismissed Stone Temple Pilots as grunge imitators, corporate manufactured versions of the real thing. Weiland had grown tired of the comparisons, tired of being called a derivative of something he believed he had helped create. In recent interviews, he'd become increasingly vocal about what he saw as Seattle's unearned superiority complex. "Grunge is just rock music," he'd told Rolling Stone just weeks earlier. "It's not some mystical Seattle invention. We've proven that you can make this music anywhere, and maybe we've proven we can make it better." The comments had made their way back to Seattle, as comments always do in the tight-knit world of alternative rock. Kurt Cobain had heard about them, but true to form, he hadn't responded publicly. Kurt rarely responded to anything publicly. He let his music speak for him, when he chose to speak at all. Nirvana arrived at the Whisky at 7:30, 30 minutes before their scheduled soundcheck. Their approach was characteristically understated. No tour bus, just a rented van that looked like it had seen better days. Kurt climbed out of the passenger seat wearing a thrift store cardigan over a faded t-shirt, his blonde hair hanging in his face, carrying his guitar case like it contained something precious. The contrast with Stone Temple Pilots couldn't have been more stark. Where STP looked like rock stars, Nirvana looked like they'd wandered in from a college coffee shop. Where Weiland commanded attention, Kurt seemed to actively avoid it. Backstage, the tension was palpable. The two bands occupied opposite ends of the small backstage area, their camps separated by more than just physical distance. STP's crew was larger, more professional, moving with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Nirvana's setup was minimal, almost casual, as if they were preparing for a basement show rather than an industry showcase. Weiland found himself studying Kurt from across the room. He'd expected someone more imposing, more obviously charismatic. Instead, he saw someone who looked almost fragile, sitting alone on a flight case, tuning his guitar with the focused attention of someone performing a ritual. "That's him?" Weiland asked his guitarist Dean DeLeo quietly. "That's the guy everyone says revolutionized rock music?" DeLeo nodded, watching Kurt work. "Don't let the appearance fool you. I've heard him play." "We'll see," Weiland replied, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and challenge. Stone Temple Pilots was scheduled to perform first, and they took the stage with the confidence of a band that had spent months perfecting their live show. Their set was polished, professional, designed to showcase their technical ability and Weiland's commanding stage presence. Songs like Sex Type Thing and Plush filled the venue with the kind of anthemic rock that radio programmers loved and crowds could sing along with. The performance was everything a grunge showcase was supposed to be. Loud guitars, driving rhythms, Weiland's powerful vocals soaring over the mix. The industry executives in attendance took notes, nodding approval at what they were hearing. This was grunge that could be marketed, packaged, sold to the masses without frightening anyone. During their final song, Weiland looked directly at the side of the stage where Kurt was standing, watching silently. Their eyes met for a moment, and Weiland's message was clear. "Match that." When STP finished their set to enthusiastic applause, Weiland walked to the microphone for what everyone assumed would be a standard thank you to the crowd. Instead, he decided to make a statement. "You know," Weiland said, his voice carrying clearly through the venue's sound system, "there's been a lot of talk lately about whether grunge is dead, whether this whole movement was just a fad that's running out of steam. Some people think the music isn't evolving, isn't growing beyond its original limitations." The room grew quiet. Everyone understood that this wasn't just casual stage banter. "Tonight, we're sharing the stage with one of the bands that supposedly created this whole scene," Weiland continued, not looking toward Kurt but making it clear who he meant. "I think it's time to find out if the originators can prove that grunge still has something to say, or if it's time for the next generation to take over." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't openly hostile, but it was unmistakably a gauntlet being thrown down. The music journalists in attendance leaned forward, sensing they might be witnessing something significant. Kurt had heard every word from the side of the stage, but his expression didn't change. He didn't acknowledge the challenge, didn't react visibly to what could have been seen as disrespect. He simply continued tuning his guitar, preparing for Nirvana's set as if nothing had happened. When Nirvana took the stage 15 minutes later, the contrast was immediately apparent. Where Stone Temple Pilots had looked like conquerors claiming their territory, Nirvana looked like they'd accidentally wandered into the spotlight. Kurt approached the microphone with none of Weiland's swagger, none of his obvious confidence. "Hi," Kurt said quietly into the microphone, his voice barely carrying to the back of the venue. "We're Nirvana. This is a song called Serve the Servants." What happened next would be talked about for years afterward by everyone who was there that night. Kurt began playing a simple, almost delicate guitar riff. Nothing flashy, nothing that announced itself as groundbreaking. But within the first few notes, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The sound was clean, precise, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume or technical complexity. When Kurt started singing, his voice was conversational, almost intimate, as if he were sharing a secret with each person in the audience individually. The lyrics were personal, vulnerable, dealing with family dysfunction and the pressure of unexpected fame. But he delivered them without drama, without asking for sympathy or understanding. "Teenage angst has paid off well. Now I'm bored and old." The words carried a devastating honesty that made Weiland's polished performance seem suddenly artificial by comparison. This wasn't someone performing emotion. This was someone processing real experience in real time, using music as a tool for understanding rather than entertainment. As the song built, Kurt's guitar work became more complex, more layered, but never lost its sense of restraint. He was showing technical ability without showing off, demonstrating that power didn't always have to announce itself loudly. Dave Grohl's drumming was precise, supportive, creating space for Kurt's voice rather than competing with it. Chris Novoselic's bass work was minimal but crucial, holding everything together without drawing attention to itself. This was a band that had learned to function as a single organism, each member supporting the whole rather than showcasing individual talent. Halfway through the song, something remarkable happened. Kurt's voice cracked slightly on a high note, a small imperfection that would have been edited out of any studio recording. But instead of trying to cover it or compensate for it, he incorporated it into the performance, making the vulnerability part of the song's emotional landscape. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every note. This wasn't music that demanded applause or crowd participation. This was music that demanded attention, contemplation, recognition of something honest being shared. When Serve the Servants ended, Kurt didn't pause for applause. He immediately launched into Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle, a song that seemed to address the very tensions that had brought both bands to this stage. The lyrics dealt with media manipulation, the commodification of authenticity, the pressure to represent something larger than yourself. Watching from the side of the stage, Weiland found himself transfixed. This wasn't the performance he'd expected. He'd anticipated noise, aggression, the kind of raw energy that grunge was supposed to represent. Instead, he was witnessing something more complex: controlled vulnerability, disciplined emotion, technical skill in service of honest expression. For the first time since forming Stone Temple, Pilots, Weiland questioned whether his band was creating music or simply reproducing it. Kurt was showing him the difference between copying a formula and understanding the emotional truth that had made the formula powerful in the first place. Nirvana's third song was Dumb, performed acoustically with Kurt alone on stage. The venue, which had been buzzing with industry chatter during sound checks and between sets, fell into complete silence. Kurt's voice, unadorned by effects or amplification, filled the space with a naked honesty that was almost uncomfortable to witness. I think I'm dumb, or maybe just happy. The lyrics were simple, self-deprecating, but delivered with such sincerity that they became profound. Kurt wasn't trying to impress anyone with his wisdom or insight. He was simply sharing his confusion about life, success, and his own place in the world. It was the kind of honesty that most performers spent their entire careers avoiding. Weiland realized he was watching someone who had figured out how to transform personal pain into universal truth without losing the specificity that made it real. This wasn't grunge as a genre or a marketing category. This was grunge as a way of processing experience, of finding meaning in confusion and beauty in imperfection. When Nirvana finished their brief set with Territorial Pissings, the energy was completely different from what Stone Temple Pilots had created. Where STP had generated excitement and approval, Nirvana had created something closer to recognition, a sense that everyone in the room had witnessed something rare and unrepeatable. The applause when it came was different too. Not the enthusiastic approval of an entertained audience, but the respectful acknowledgement of people who had been allowed to witness something private and important. Kurt unplugged his guitar, said thank you into the microphone, and walked off stage without ceremony. No banter with the crowd, no request for more applause, no awareness that he had just answered Weiland's challenge in a way that made the challenge itself seem irrelevant. Backstage afterward, Weiland found himself seeking Kurt out, not to confront him or continue any kind of competition, but because he needed to understand what he'd just witnessed. Weiland started, then stopped. Kurt was sitting in the same spot as before, tuning his guitar even though the performance was over. Hey, Kurt said, looking up with no apparent awareness that anything significant had just happened. You guys sounded good out there. Very tight. The comment was genuine, without sarcasm or condescension. Kurt seemed genuinely unaware that his performance had just redefined what Weiland thought rock music could accomplish. How do you do that? Weiland asked. How do you make it so real? Kurt looked puzzled. I don't know what you mean. I just play what I feel. But the way you performed Dumb, the way you made everyone in that room feel like you were speaking directly to them. I wasn't performing anything, Kurt replied quietly. That's just how I feel most of the time. Confused, you know? The music helps me figure things out. Weiland studied Kurt's face, looking for signs of false modesty or calculated humility. He found neither. Kurt genuinely seemed unaware of the power he wielded, the way his honesty affected other people. The challenge I made from the stage, Weiland said, about proving grunge isn't dead. I heard that, Kurt nodded, but I don't really think about grunge as something that can be alive or dead. It's just music that comes from a certain place, you know? If you're in that place, the music makes sense. If you're not, it doesn't. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but for Weiland, the crucial moment had already passed. He'd entered the evening believing that grunge was a formula that could be mastered, improved upon, evolved into something more commercially viable. Kurt had shown him that grunge wasn't a formula at all. It was a byproduct of honesty, a way of processing experience that couldn't be manufactured or replicated without losing its essential quality. Years later, in a 2003 interview with Alternative Press, Weiland would reflect on that December evening at the Whisky A Go-Go. The interview took place during a period when Stone Temple Pilots was on hiatus, and Weiland was struggling with personal demons that had plagued him for years. I went into that show thinking I could prove something, Weiland admitted, that Stone Temple Pilots could do grunge better than the Seattle bands, that we could take their formula and perfect it. I came out understanding that I'd been approaching the whole thing backwards. The interviewer asked what Kurt had taught him that night. That authenticity isn't something you can achieve through technique or effort, Weiland replied. It's something you either have access to or you don't, and it depends entirely on your willingness to be honest about what you're going through. Kurt wasn't trying to be authentic. He was just being himself, and his music was a reflection of that self. The power came from the honesty, not from any particular sound or style. Did that change how Stone Temple Pilots approached music? Weiland was quiet for a long moment. It changed how I thought about what we were trying to do. Whether it changed our music is something other people would have to judge. But I know that after that night, I started writing songs from a different place, started thinking about what I actually wanted to say, rather than what would sound good or fit into a particular genre. Any regrets about the challenge you made? Not regrets exactly, but I realize now that I was asking the wrong question. I was asking whether grunge could survive and evolve. Kurt showed me that the real question was whether individual artists could find ways to be honest about their experience. The genre stuff, the categories and labels, that's just industry machinery. The music itself is something else entirely. The night Scott Weiland challenged Kurt Cobain to prove grunge wasn't dead, then watched him demonstrate that the question itself missed the point entirely. It wasn't about genres or movements or commercial viability. It was about individual artists finding ways to transform personal truth into universal recognition. Sometimes the most important lessons come disguised as competitions, and sometimes the most powerful responses are the ones that refuse to acknowledge the competition at all. Kurt Cobain never tried to prove that grunge wasn't dead. He simply continued being honest about his own experience, and that honesty made any debate about genres seem suddenly irrelevant.